Good morning, students. Today is Thursday, 25 March 2021. This is our second of 3 days on ethical egoism, which is chapter 6. And we will finish our discussion next week, probably on Monday or Tuesday. Our exam is 1 week from today, the 1st of April. So let's get started. This lecture today won't take that long. We're going to cover only one section today. It's the section entitled Some Common Misconceptions About Egoism. So just as John Stuart Mill spent a great deal of time clarifying his theory, which is now known as act utilitarianism, we need to make sure that before we begin to criticize ethical egoism, that we formulate it correctly. And we need to be fair to it. If there are problems with it, those problems will come out. But it would be too easy to misstate the theory and then find fault with it. So you should always keep this in mind. Before you proceed to criticize any theory or any argument, make sure you state it in the strongest possible way. And that way, if you find fault with it, you will really have accomplished something. Otherwise, you haven't accomplished anything. So let's get started. The first misconception about ethical egoism is that it requires short-run or short-term gratification. The theory does not say things like this. It does not say live for the moment. Live for the moment. That would imply that I should do whatever feels good to me right now without giving any thought to what the consequences of my behavior might be tomorrow or down the road, a week from now, a month from now, or even years from now. You should always look at things in the long term, not just the short term. Another slogan that you sometimes hear, and I almost said it a moment ago, is if it feels good, do it. Well, that's not at all what ethical egoism says. Sometimes, even though something may feel good at the moment, it would be wrong to do it, because it would not be in your long-term best interests. So let me make a distinction that I think captures the difference. There's a difference between taking an interest in something and something being in your interest. There are things that I may take an interest in that are not in my interest. Some people smoke cigarettes or use other forms of tobacco, and they may do so because they take an interest in it. It's interesting to them. They may have a desire to do it, but it's probably not in their long-term interest to do it, to smoke, for example, or use chewing tobacco. Studies show that the use of tobacco causes cancer. Right? It's linked to cancer. Maybe not everyone who uses tobacco products comes down with cancer, but a great many do. So there's a causal connection between the two events. So taking an interest in tobacco does not mean that it's in your interest to use it. So do you see the difference? There may also be things that are in your interest that you are not interested in doing. When I was a child, my parents made me eat peas, and I didn't like the taste of peas, and I complained about it. My mother made me eat them anyway. And when I asked why do I have to eat these peas? They're awful. She said, they're good for you, right? In other words, they're in my interest, whether I'm interested in them or not. Now, there are, of course, things that are both in our interest and that we take an interest in. Have you ever had that experience? It could be that something that's actually good for you is something you like to eat. You like the taste of it. Several years ago, I discovered that dark chocolate has beneficial health effects. I believe, I've forgotten what exactly they are. I think it has to do with your heart. Your heart will be healthier if you eat a small quantity of dark chocolate on a regular basis. So, isn't that interesting? I take an interest in chocolate, and it so happens that it's in my interest to eat it. Now, of course, anything can be consumed excessively. So you should always do things in moderation, including eating chocolate. And there's a difference between dark chocolate and other kinds of chocolate, like milk chocolate. I believe the study I saw specifically focused on dark chocolate. So to this day, I keep on hand in my house a quantity of Dove dark chocolate. And on a regular basis, usually at least once a day, I will eat one, two, or three of those little pieces of dark chocolate. And I like it, it's good, but it's also good for me. So sometimes life creates situations where the very thing you want to do is good for you. It's in your long term best interest. But those two things don't always go together. You see that? Sometimes you may take an interest in something that's not in your interest, and sometimes you may not take an interest in things that are in your interest. So, what does ethical egoism say? Ethical egoism says that you should focus on the things that are in your interest in the long run, not necessarily the things that you're interested in. So, it may be that you should forego things that you would otherwise like to do or consume. Let me give some examples. Suppose, like my brother, my youngest brother, Gary, he was a very good wrestler in high school in Michigan. He got good grades. He was an A and B student. He had every opportunity to go off to college. And I even drove him to one of the small colleges where he could have wrestled and I think had a good experience there. He could have gotten a degree while indulging his love for wrestling. But he thought it over and he decided not to go. Not only not to go to that college, but not to go to any college at all. And when I asked him about that, he told me that he wanted to go out into the working world right away. I recall him saying something like, I don't want to take another exam the rest of my life. He was sick of taking exams in high school and he wanted to get a job. His friends had been purchasing these four-wheel drive pickup trucks and he wanted one. And he didn't want to wait 4 years or more to be able to buy one. He figured that if he got a job, even if it's a menial job, he would at least start earning money and he could get that truck that he wanted. Now, there's a nice ending to this story. My brother Gary never set foot in college. He got a job as a welder in a small factory in Michigan. And because he was good at what he did, and because he was a hard worker, he got promoted. And eventually, the boss, the owner of the shop, promoted him to the point where he was running the shop. And he now works at a different place. But because of the skills he learned in managing that small factory, he is now the manager of a larger factory. He makes good income. He probably earns more than I do. I'm pretty sure he does. And so things worked out well for my brother. Although at the time, I would have told him that according to studies, a person with a bachelor's degree over the course of a lifetime earns considerably more money than someone without a bachelor's degree. So my brother's case is a little bit unusual. You could say that he was lucky. He was one of the people who doesn't have a bachelor's degree, who did well for himself. Or you could say that he used his discipline and his hard work and his native intelligence to get ahead without a degree. So when you choose between going off to college and going into the working world, according to ethical egoism, you should make your decision based on your long-term expected well-being. And that may well caution you to go to college and get a degree, because it's far more likely that that will maximize your long-term happiness than not going to college. Now, keep in mind, I'm not assuming that money is the same as happiness. There is, of course, a linkage between the two. What's the old saying? Money can't buy happiness, which is obviously true. But if you have a certain amount of money, it certainly can provide the basis for things and activities that do make you happy. So there may be a correlation between how much money you have and how happy you are. And that's all I'm suggesting here, is that if you go to college and earn a degree, the chances are very good that you will have higher earnings over the course of your working life, and that will be correlated with happiness. Okay, so notice I'm qualifying a lot of what I'm saying. The wrong lesson to take from what I'm saying is that egoism tells you to earn as much money as you can. It does not say that. It may well say that you should earn enough money to provide the basis for happiness, but that doesn't mean that you should worship money and pursue it at all costs. That may be a recipe for unhappiness rather than happiness. I'm sure you've seen real world cases where someone with lots of money is very unhappy. And there's certainly depictions of this in novels and in movies. People who are fabulously rich, and yet they seem miserable. That's a common phenomenon. So money may be connected to happiness, but it's certainly not a guarantee of it. Okay, other examples that I would give to you about the difference between doing something that's in your interest versus doing something that you take an interest in. I mentioned smoking or using tobacco products. I just discussed the choice between going to college and going into the working world. What about things like binge drinking? No, binge drinking is not the same as drinking. Binge drinking, by definition, is where you set out to get drunk and to impair your abilities to drive or other things, to do other things. Now, binge drinking may be something you take an interest in. Maybe you look forward to the weekend so that you can go out and get drunk with your friends, engage in binge drinking. But you have to ask yourself, if you're an ethical egoist, is binge drinking in your long-term best interests? There was an article in the Shorthorn several years ago. I have a copy here in my notes, but I think I'll just give you the gist of it rather than reading it to you. And it shows that according to the experts, binge drinking on a regular basis over a period of time, binge drinking is associated with a great many physical problems. Problems with the liver, problems with brain function, and lots of other things as well. So if you care about your long-term welfare or well-being or happiness, as ethical egoism says you must, then you should give a great deal of thought to binge drinking, and you should probably forego it altogether. That's not the same as foregoing the use of alcohol. It may in fact be that the use of alcohol in moderation has good consequences for your well-being. I've heard studies over the years that suggest that 1 glass of wine per day, perhaps after a meal or during a meal, is good for your heart. And that, of course, is one of the most important organs in your body. So you want to have good heart health. And you should do things like eat dark chocolate and lots of other things to keep your heart healthy. Regular, vigorous exercise, for example, will keep your heart strong. Your heart is a muscle, and you need to exercise your muscles on a regular basis. So an ethical egoist would say that you should either abstain from alcohol altogether or use it in small quantities that are calculated to promote long-term health. Now, it may start to seem to you that ethical egoism, which seemed exciting at first, is now getting quite boring. I mean, ethical egoism is starting to look like your mother or father telling you, don't do this, don't do that, forego this, abstain from that, and so on. And the truth is, ethical egoism is an austere moral doctrine. By austere, I mean stern and demanding. But it's no more demanding than act utilitarianism. So if demandingness is a problem, it's a problem that afflicts more than one theory. Remember, act utilitarianism requires that when you act, you take into account the interests of everyone who is affected by your act, even animals, and even strangers, people you don't even know and have never met and know little or nothing about. They still matter morally, and you must take them into account if you're an act utilitarian. So, yeah, ethical egoism is just as demanding, except it tells you that you should refrain from doing things that go against your long term interests. So let me quote John Stuart Mill, and then I'm going to revise his quotation to make it applicable to ethical egoism. Here's what Mill wrote in his little book, Utilitarianism. He said, as between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. And that's how you have to view things if you're an act utilitarian. You have to be an impartial spectator. Your own happiness must be taken into account, but it counts for no more than anyone else's, including strangers. Now, let me paraphrase Mill and make it applicable to ethical egoism. And you'll see that it's just as austere, just as stern, and just as demanding. Okay, I'm going to paraphrase it. As between his present self and future selves, egoism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. So notice, what changed? Act utilitarianism says you've got to be impartial between yourself and other people or other individuals. Ethical egoism says that you must be impartial as between your current self, the one that exists right now, and all of your future selves. Now that's mind-boggling in a way. There is a current Keith, right? The one who's talking to you right now. Right? This is my present self. There will be a Keith tomorrow in all likelihood. That's a future Keith. And that future Keith has interests just as the present Keith has interests. Now, I'm older than you are, so will there be a Keith in 5 years? I certainly hope so. I'm taking steps to ensure that that is the case, or at least make it more likely to be the case by exercising and eating a good diet, things like that. What about 10 years from now? Again, I hope there's a Keith 10 years from now. What about 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 years from now? Now, I'm almost 64. 40 years would make me 104. There are people who live that long. And if I do, I will certainly want to be healthy and happy rather than miserable and in pain and disabled. So egoism requires that I pay attention to and show respect for each stage of my self. Today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, all the way up through as long as I live. Now, there is one qualification to what I'm saying. What would you say is the probability that I currently exist? Well, it's 100, right? I'm now talking to you, so I exist. It's certain. The fact that I'm talking means that I exist. What is the probability that I will be here tomorrow, or that I will lecture a few days from now? Well, it's not quite 100, is it? Because things can happen. I could be killed on my bike ride later today. Perish the thought, but it could happen. And lots of other things could happen. I could die of a heart attack in the next 24 hours. So the probability that tomorrow's Keith will be in existence is less than the probability that today's Keith is in existence. And we could keep going with this. What's the probability that there will be a Keith 2 days from now? It will be less than the probability that there will be a Keith tomorrow, which itself is less than the probability that there is a Keith today. So what's the probability that there will be a Keith 5 years from now? Well, you can see the probability goes down the farther you go into the future. Okay? So what is the probability that there will be 100-year-old Keith? It's not zero, is it? It's not the probability is not zero, because it is possible that there will be 100-year-old Keith. But the probability is probably very small. Probably around, I don't know, I'll just make up a figure that's pretty small, 5%. There may be only one chance in 20 that I will live until I'm 100. So let me come back to the point I'm making. When I respect each of my future selves, I am allowed to discount the happiness of those future selves, but only to reflect the improbability that they will actually be there in existence. You see what I'm saying? So it's rational to discount the interests of your future selves, to take account of the unlikelihood that they will actually exist. So it's a subtle point. You have to show respect for each of your future selves, but that respect can be discounted or reduced in quantity by the unlikelihood that those future selves will exist. And that's what a rational person would do, right? You take that into account when you make decisions today. And remember, that's not only what a rational person would do, but that's what morality requires one to do according to ethical egoism. Think of it this way. Ethical egoism makes morally mandatory that you be rational. Promoting your long-term rational self-interest is required by this theory. That's partly why it's demanding. This theory doesn't just say it's permissible for you to maximize your long-term interest. It says you're required to do it. It says that of all the actions available to you right now, the act that's right is the one that ranks highest. Every other act is wrong. Every other act that's below that one is wrong. It's the same thing that we saw in connection with act utilitarianism. Once you rank all the actions, only one of them is right. All the others are wrong. And the one that's right is obligatory. It's not just permissible, but it's obligatory. Anything else you do is one of those acts that's wrong, the ones that rank below it. So again, we keep coming back to this point. Ethical egoism is demanding. If you thought that this theory just tells you do whatever you feel like doing, do what makes you feel good, live for the moment, it's not the case. Right? That's a misconception about ethical egoism. Some people describe ethical egoism as enlightened, long-term, rational self-interest. Enlightened means that you're making decisions in light of the facts, right? The light is on. That means you're paying attention. You understand all the facts when you act. Okay, it's enlightened. It's long-term, not just short-term. Now, the short-term counts, but so does the long-term. That's the important point. Okay, enlightened, long-term, rational self-interest. The word rational means that you make your decisions not based on wish fulfillment or how you would like things to be, right? It's hard-headed, right? Ethical egoism is a hard-headed, rational doctrine, and you must take all of the facts, the scientific facts, into account when you act. The facts about drinking. Right? Don't say, well, maybe binge drinking won't cause any problems for me in the long run. Well, that's wishful thinking. The studies show that binge drinking is linked to a number of very serious health problems. You can look it up, right? Google it, as they say. Right? Do some research. That's the rational part of ethical egoism. Right? Make sure it's factually informed. Make sure that before you act, you have done your research on not only the long-term effects of the act, but the short-term effects. All of them must be counted. Now, here's a few other examples of actions that may be in your short-term best interest, but are probably not in your long-term best interest? How about unprotected sex? And by unprotected, I mean sex where you leave open the possibility of contracting some kind of disease, an STD, sexually transmitted disease. Is it in your interest to contract a sexually transmitted disease? The question answers itself. Of course it isn't. What about pregnancy? Another sense of unprotected sex means without taking adequate birth control precautions. Now, there's nothing wrong, of course, with having children, but they need to come at the right time in the right way. If you have sex with, let's call it casual sex, it may feel good, but it may or may not be in your long-term best interest. What if your studies are not yet completed and you find you're pregnant, or your girlfriend is pregnant if you're a male? That's going to change your life dramatically, and it could have adverse effects on your long-term happiness. So an ethical egoist would say, abstain from sex, or at least unprotected sex, until you're ready to be a parent, financially ready, emotionally ready. Wait until your career is going, right? Until you have a good job with benefits, and then start thinking about a family. Right? Many people have unprotected sex and end up with a child. They may love the child, but the child is an impediment to long-term happiness, okay? Because the child has come too early. So there's a case where what feels good at the moment may not be in your long-term best interest. What about risky activities like high-risk sports? Are they in your long-term best interest? Now, every sport comes with its own risks. I'm a cyclist. I've broken several bones. It comes with the territory, so to speak. It's not pleasant, and I hope never to break any more bones, but there's a good chance I will, and I'm prepared for that. The benefits of cycling, including the pleasure I get from doing it, to me outweigh the risk of breaking bones and other injuries. My wife might disagree with that. She takes care of me when I break my bones, and I'm sure she will not be happy if I do it again. So obviously I take precautions and try to be as careful as I can while I'm riding. But some sports are very dangerous. I mean, every sport has incidental risks. What about sports like mountain climbing? There are people who try to climb Mount Everest every year. A number of people go and try. The mortality rate is quite high as far as sporting events go. Lots of people die trying to ascend Mount Everest. Is it in your long-term, rational, enlightened self-interest to do such a thing? That depends on on not only the extent of the risks, which are quite high, it also takes into account the magnitude of the risks, and the magnitude is pretty high because you could die. It's not just a broken bone that will heal, or a sickness that can be cured, but it could be death. How much pleasure are you likely to derive from the attempt, the planning, the attempt, and then thinking about it for the rest of your life if you succeed in climbing Mount Everest? An ethical egoist may very well say that it's wrong to attempt an ascent of Mount Everest. It's simply not in your long-term rational self-interest. So it's quite possible that ethical egoism will rule out certain highly dangerous activities, such as sports. That doesn't mean it rules out every activity, like cycling or playing softball, playing volleyball, water skiing, things like that. Okay? So I'm not suggesting that ethical egoism tells you to stay home in your house and never go out and drive your car or ride a bike or go skiing or anything like that. It certainly doesn't have that implication. What it does say is that whenever you engage in a risky activity, make sure you do a full-blown calculation, taking into account its risks, objective risks. Make sure that you take into account not only the short-term pleasure that it brings you, but also the long-term pain and suffering multiplied by the probability that those pains and sufferings will come about. So be rational about it. Make sure that whenever you take a risk, the risk is calculated. Make sure that the risk is justified by the pleasure, the long-term pleasure or well-being that it will bring to you. Now, what about some other actions that may or may not be in your long-term best interest? What about lying? Now, you may think that from time to time, lying is in your interest. If a lie can get you out of a tight spot, if a lie can keep you from being fired from your job or save a relationship that you value, you might think that lying is the right thing to do according to ethical egoism. But you've got to keep in mind that if you lie, there's a non-zero probability that you will be found out, that the person to whom you lied may come to learn of the lie. And then bad consequences will occur. Right? Recriminations are often in order when you find that someone has lied to you. Someone may break up with you because you lied. I guess it would depend on how big the lie is and how important it is. But you could lose the relationship you're in because of a lie you told. You could get fired if you told a lie to keep your job, and your employer ever finds out about it, the employer may then fire you. And if you're fired for lying, the word may spread in your industry, and it may keep you from getting another job with another employer. So a lie that is found out, and there's always a chance that you'll be found out if you lie, a lie may help destroy your reputation. Is it in your long-term interest to have a bad reputation? Probably not. And what about things like cheating? You may have been tempted to cheat on an exam in a course you're taking in college or back in high school. You may look only at the short run and think, you know what, I think I can get away with it. It will help me get a good grade in this course without studying or studying too hard. And that will help me get a good grade point average. And that will help me maybe graduate with honors or keep my scholarship. And maybe it'll help me get a better job down the road. So you may conclude that you're going to cheat, thinking that cheating is in your interest. It may well be in your short-term interest, but is it really in your long-term interest? I've always told my students that if I catch them cheating, I will play a prosecutor. I will do whatever I can to see that that student is kicked out of the university. Now that may seem terrible to you. What? You really would? You would try to get me kicked out of UTA? Well, I would, honestly. Cheating is the cardinal sin of academia. Right? It's the worst thing you can do in an academic setting. The goal of academia is to pursue the truth. And it's a merit system. Right? We rank our students based on how well they have mastered the material and acquired the skills that we're inculcating in them. Cheaters try to bypass all of that. And it's not fair. When you cheat, you may get ranked above some student who worked hard and didn't cheat. And that's unfair. So cheating is really bad. And most professors take it very seriously. Right? We don't treat it as though it were just a petty offense. And of course, UTA has rules about what should happen to students who are caught cheating. And it's those rules that I will exploit. I will see to it that the rules are applied to make cheating pay for cheaters. Okay? So if you're tempted to cheat on the ground that you think you can get away with it, think again, because there are lots of ways professors have to find out that their students are cheating. And the repercussions are quite serious as far as your life and career. So I would suggest that according to ethical egoism, cheating is wrong. It's rarely, if ever, the right thing to do to cheat, simply because it's always possible you'll be caught, and then really bad things will happen to you over a long period of time. So just banish it from your mind. And of course, it's possible to cheat in athletic competitions as it is in academia. Maybe the highest profile case of this is Lance Armstrong. I was a defender of Lance Armstrong, the cyclist from Texas, for many years. I defended him from the critics who accused him of cheating. Right? It seemed to me that they were envious of him. Right? Lance Armstrong had never tested positive for any performance-enhancing drugs. And while lots of people accused him of using them, no one had come forward credibly with any evidence that he had. And so we had to decide, those of us who supported him, what's more likely to be the case, that he's an exceptional athlete, a very successful one, or that he's a cheater. Well, as you probably know, it turned out that he was cheating. He admitted it. He went on Oprah Winfrey's show years ago and admitted that he had broken the rules of his sport in a way that would have helped him win races. He won the Tour de France 7 consecutive years, which is a staggering achievement. We'll never know how many tours he would have won had he not cheated. That's the real tragedy to me, is that we'll never know. It's possible that even if he had never cheated, he would have won several Tours de France, maybe the same 7 that he ended up winning. But we'll never know, will we? So Lance Armstrong had his career destroyed. He was sued by many people for millions of dollars, and he had to pay the people who sued him. It almost broke him. And he has to live in disgrace. He has disgraced his children, his wife, his mother, his friends. Everyone who knew him, loved him, and defended him was disgraced by his behavior. Is it in Lance Armstrong's long-term best interest to live that way, to go down in history as one of the great cheaters in sport history? If you look up the winners of the Tour de France on Wikipedia, for example, you'll see that the list of winners for the 7 years he won the race, they, I believe, now have a line through his name, right? It says Lance Armstrong 7 times, and they've got a line through it, and then there's a footnote explaining that his tours, his titles were taken away from him. And that will be a part of his permanent record for all time. Right? He will go down in history as a cheater, as a disgraced human being. Okay, I suggest to you that's not in his long-term best interest. He may have a certain amount of money and be living a good life, but that's the material aspect of his life, right? His reputation is stained forever. And if you care about such things, then you would be well advised not to cheat, as he admitted to doing. What about stealing? What about breaking any law? Is it in your interest to break a law against theft or robbery or burglary or anything else? It's pretty clearly not in your long-term best interest. Why? Because there's always a chance you will be apprehended, indicted, tried, convicted, and punished. Right? However smart you think you are, right? Many criminals think that they're smarter than the authorities. Oh, I'll get away with it. I've been around the block. I know how to get away with burglary or whatever. Well, there's always a chance that you'll be apprehended and tried and punished for it, and may spend decades in prison. Is it in your interest to spend decades in prison? The question answers itself. So isn't it interesting that a theory that may have seemed to you to tell you to do whatever you want or think you can get away with ends up saying, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't break the law, take care of your loved ones, be a good friend and neighbor, help people in need. All of those things probably do maximize your long-term best interest. And therefore, according to ethical egoism, they are the right thing to do. So what may have seemed to you like an exciting theory ends up being quite a downer, doesn't it? It tells you to live by rules of thumb, like obey the law, that are the same rules that an act utilitarian would live by, for example. Okay, so let me move on to another major misconception about ethical egoism. Ethical egoism does not tell you never to benefit anybody. Okay, that would be a misconception. You may benefit other people. Whom? The people you may benefit are the people you care about. If you love somebody, your children, let's say, loving your children means caring about them for their own sake. And that means wanting things to go well for them in the long run. Your children's welfare, when you love them, has become part of your own welfare, part of your own happiness. That's why when people lose children, especially young children, they find that maybe they can never be happy again or as happy. I'm think here of the case of Charles Darwin, the naturalist. I read a biography of him many years ago. He had several children, but one of his children was named Annie. And Annie was the light of his and his wife's life. She was a very special child. Darwin wrote glowingly of her, how much she brightened up the household, how sweet and kind and loving she was. And when Annie died, you probably knew this was coming, when Annie died, it broke them. Darwin wrote that he and his wife would never be the same again, and they weren't. Even though they had other children and they loved them just as much, the death of Annie deprived them of happiness in the long run. It broke them. And that's true of others who've lost children. So that shows you that when you love your children or when you love anyone, that you have made that person's welfare or happiness part of your own. And therefore, according to ethical egoism, in order for you to maximize your own happiness or well-being in the long run, you must do things that promote the welfare or well-being or happiness of those you love. Okay? Now, that's required. If you love people, then you are required to do things that benefit them. So it's the opposite of what you may have thought. If you thought that ethical egoism prevents you from benefiting others, think again. It does not have that implication. Now, you may be wondering, what if you don't love somebody? What if you, and maybe that's psychologically impossible, but let's imagine it anyway. It's logically possible. Imagine someone who literally doesn't love anyone else, not even a dog or a cat or a pet. That person, according to ethical egoism, really would have to focus only on his or her own happiness, because that person hasn't taken an interest in anyone else's well-being. You see that? So, given that you love others, you not only may benefit them, but ethical egoism requires that you benefit them, because it requires that you maximize your own long-term happiness. And their happiness has become part of your happiness through the act of loving them. And Feldman has an example of a philanthropist. The philanthropist, which means a wealthy person who's inclined to help others, the wealthy man can spend his money on things such as a yacht that give him pleasure, Or he can spend his money on things such as a college library that give pleasure to others. Ethical egoism does not tell him to buy the yacht and the jewelry and the other things that would make him happy. What it tells him is maximize your own long-term happiness. And if he's the kind of person who derives pleasure from helping others, which he may be, then ethical egoism may well tell him that you must, morally speaking, you must spend your money on the college library because it will promote the happiness and well-being of people you take an interest in. So what the theory tells him to do with his money depends on what would make him happy. And maybe he would be made happy by helping others and making other people happy. So it's an interesting and complicated thing, this theory, isn't it? And it may have started off sounding really simple, right? Just focus on yourself and do what makes you happy. We now know it says nothing of the sort. It doesn't say do whatever makes you happy in the short run. We know that. And it doesn't say do what makes you happy. It says perform whichever action promotes your happiness, even if your happiness is dependent on other people's happiness. And that may require that you do things to benefit others. So ethical egoism does not prohibit what Feldman calls altruism. It does not prohibit beneficence, which means doing good for others. Whether it requires beneficence or altruism depends on whether you take an interest in those others. If you do, then you may well be required to promote their interests. Okay, a couple more misconceptions. These can be disposed of pretty quickly. Don't confuse egoism with egotism. The only difference between the words is that there's one letter different. Egoism, egotism. There's a T in that second word that's not in the first word. Now here's what egotism means. If you look it up in a dictionary, and here's what I typed in my notes. Egotist means excessive use of the words I and me. It also means the practice of talking about oneself. It means an exaggerated opinion of oneself. It means selfishness. So an egotistical person is a person who has an inflated sense of self-importance or self-worth. And because of that, an egotist likes talking about himself or herself. So the way to remember the difference between egoism, which is a normative ethical theory, and egotism, which is a bad character trait of a person, is the letter T in egotism means talking. An egotist loves talking about him or herself. So that may help you remember the difference between them. Now, is there any connection between being an egoist and being an egotist? That's an interesting question. Well, certainly there's no necessary connection. What I mean by that is it's possible to be an egoist without being an egotist. And it's possible to be an egotist without being an egoist. Both of those things are possible. And that means there's no necessary connection between them. I actually have some examples. You want to hear them? Here's an example of an egoist who is also an egotist. It's Ayn Rand. I think I mentioned her the other day. Her first name is spelled A-Y-N. It's pronounced Ayn. And her last name is Rand, R-A-N-D. Ayn Rand was an egoist. She was an ethical egoist. And it just so happens that she was an egotist, meaning egotistical. Now, I've read a lot about Ayn Rand. She thought very, very highly of herself. She was very sharp with people who disagreed with her. In fact, she cast out of her circle lots of people for the smallest slights. If she expected her disciples practically to worship her. And when she saw signs that they weren't properly worshipful of her, she cast them out, often hurting their feelings tremendously. There's a philosopher named John Hospers who taught for many years at the University of Southern California. He was an acolyte of Ayn Rand. He knew her for a while. He admired her, he learned from her, and he shared many of her views, including ethical egoism. Ayn Rand discovered that he had written an article on a topic that she didn't like. I think it was in aesthetics. And she cast him out. And it hurt him very much to be cast out by somebody he admired so much. So take my word for it, she was a very egotistical person. And it just so happens she was an ethical egoist. So what that shows is you can be both. Here's an example of where they come apart. Jeremy Bentham, as you know, was a great utilitarian. Some people call him the founder or father of utilitarianism. Remember, John Stuart Mill was his godson and learned at his knee the basics of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham was not an egoist. He was a utilitarian. But guess what? He was egotistical. Why do I say that? How do I know that? Jeremy Bentham stipulated, when he was an old man, he wrote a will, and he stipulated that in his will that when he died, he wanted his body dissected so that the doctors could learn whatever they could about diseases. He hoped that they would be able to apply their knowledge to help others. He also stipulated that his head be removed after he died, and his head he wanted stuffed. He had read about the Maori tribe in New Zealand who had a practice of head shrinking. And Bentham had a plan. He wanted his stuffed body, actually his skeleton, he wanted his skeleton removed and stuffed. He wanted his clothing, his actual clothing, put on the stuffed skeleton. He wanted his head to be preserved in the manner of the Maori. He wanted the head put on the body, the stuffed body, with his hat on it. And he wanted the whole body, the stuffed body, to be displayed in perpetuity, meaning forever. Why? Because Bentham thought that he was a great benefactor of humankind. And he wanted his stuffed body to be around forever as an inspiration to others to be benefactors of humanity. He thought that that would be a way to spread the utilitarian gospel. Right? He called this the auto-icon. An icon is a symbol. Auto means self. The auto-icon is a symbol of the self. So Bentham, the person, is dead and gone and will never return. But his body, in his likeness, will live forever and serve as an ongoing inspiration for humanity. Now, I ask you, and by the way, go to Google and do an image search. Type in Jeremy Bentham auto-icon, and you'll see pictures of his stuffed body. You can go to the University College London. Oh, wait a minute, is that the yes, University College London. You can go there today and ask to see Bentham's body. They will walk you down the hall, open up a closet, and there will be a wooden case. When you open up the case, there behind a pane of glass is Jeremy Bentham, seated with his walking stick. Now, this may gross you out, but Bentham's The process of shrinking his head didn't go very well. It did shrink the head, but it also turned it black. It burned it. And the people to whom Bentham left his estate decided that they were not going to put that head on the stuffed body. So they had a plastic head made instead that looked like Bentham. The head, the actual head, was placed between the feet. And there it sat for many, many decades. The stories that I've heard are that students at the university, from time to time, pranksters, would break into the case, remove Jeremy Bentham's shrunken head, and play soccer with it out in the quad. I've read a story where one day a dean came in and saw an object underneath the hedges in the quad. Inspecting, he discovered that it was Jeremy Bentham's head. So he ordered that the head be locked in a case thereafter, so the students couldn't get to it. Anyway, the head was placed beneath the feet for a long time. I think the head has since been removed. It probably grossed people out to see it. But there are images of it online, and you can look at it for yourself. Okay, sorry about the long-winded story. It's macabre, but it illustrates something. Jeremy Bentham was egotistical, as you can see from this auto icon. But he was not an ethical egoist. He was a utilitarian. Okay, what about the other way? Can you be an egoist without being an egotist? Certainly you can. Here are some people who are egoists, but to my knowledge, were not particularly egotistical. Jesse Kalin, Edward Regis. They have both written philosophical articles in defense of ethical egoism, and I have no reason whatsoever to believe that either one of them was egotistical, like Ayn Rand or Jeremy Bentham. So there you have an example of egoists who are not egotistical. And you could be neither an egoist nor an egotist. I think a good example of this is John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill, as you know, was not an ethical egoist. He was a utilitarian. And I've read many biographies and even John Stuart Mill's autobiography. Mill was humble about his abilities, his accomplishments. He was not at all a bragging sort of person, bragging about his accomplishments or talking excessively about what he had accomplished. Okay, so he was not an egotist. He was not egotistical. So I've given you examples of all four combinations, haven't I? I've given you an example of someone who is egotistical and also an egoist. That was Ayn Rand. I've given you an example of someone who is egotistical but not an egoist. That's Jeremy Bentham. I've given you an example of egoists who were not egotistical, Jesse Kalin and Edward Regis. And I just gave you an example of someone who was neither an egoist nor an egotist. That's John Stuart Mill. Let me give you one little tidbit on Mill, since I talked a lot about Bentham. I told you that Mill was groomed to carry on the work of Jeremy Bentham. His father, James Mill, and Bentham both educated him from birth to carry on Bentham's work. And Mill did. Mill wrote voluminously during his lifetime, millions and millions of words. His collected works contain dozens of volumes, big fat volumes. I own quite a few of them. Mill wrote on every topic you can imagine, from logic to metaphysics to aesthetics, science, politics, law, morality, everything. When Mill died, his daughter-in-law was at his bedside. And his last words to her before he died were, "You know that I have done my work." Now, you may be wondering, what the heck does that mean? Well, Mill believed that he was duty-bound to do the work that his father and Jeremy Bentham laid out for him. And he knew that his stepdaughter, Helen, who had seen him for many decades writing, slaving away, publishing, writing on every topic, he knew that she would understand what he was saying. What he was saying to her is, you, Helen, having watched me day in and day out for many decades, you know that I've done my work. I did the work that was laid out for me. I did my duty, is what he was saying. My life was the carrying out of my duty. And I've done it to the best of my ability. And you know that, Helen. That's what he meant to say, I'm sure. That doesn't sound like something an egotistical person would say, does it? It sounds like he didn't do anything special or out of the ordinary. In his mind, all he did was what he was duty-bound to do or required to do. And that's not bragging. If anything, that's the opposite of bragging. He's saying, I did nothing special. All I did was what duty required of me. Okay, one more misconception and we'll be done. Feldman formulates ethical egoism in a couple of unacceptable ways. He calls them E sub 2 and E sub 3. Let me read them to you. These are from Feldman's pages 84, and both of them are from page 84. E sub 2, which is an incorrect formulation, but I'm going to read it anyway, goes like this. An act is morally right if and only if no alternative would produce a greater balance of pleasure over pain for me. Now, the word me picks somebody out, right? And the reason this is incorrect is ethical egoism doesn't pick out one person and tell everyone else to maximize that person's long-term happiness, right? That's an incorrect formulation. We know that's not what the theory says. Nor does it say this. This is E sub 3. An act is morally right if and only if no alternative would produce a greater balance of pleasure over pain for blank, where that blank is to be filled in with somebody's name, like Fred Feldman. Now, Feldman admits he would like a theory like that. Can you imagine? Can you imagine everybody is obligated morally to maximize Fred Feldman's welfare, long-term happiness? Now, Feldman's going to love that theory, as I would if my name were filled into that blank. But clearly, that's not the intention of ethical egoism. Ethical egoism says each person has the moral duty to promote his or her own long-term rational self-interest. So the correct formulation of ethical egoism is E sub 1. It's on page 82 of the book. Let me read it to you. An act is morally right if and only if no alternative to that act has higher agent utility than it has. Period. Notice, it's very close to U sub 7. The only difference is one word. The word is agent. U sub 7 required that each person maximize utility, which is overall utility. Ethical egoism requires that each person maximize agent utility, which is his or her own utility. So ethical egoism says at any given moment, ask yourself, which actions could I perform right now? And rank them from high to low in terms of the amount of agent utility they would produce in the long run. Okay, so this one is, suppose this one's the highest. We'll call it Act A. Suppose it produces 1,000 units of pleasure for me, the agent. Act B produces 999 units of pleasure for me in the long run. And then C, D, E, and F. This theory says whichever act ranks highest is the right thing to do. Every other act below that one is wrong. Remember, wrong means not right. And keep in mind there could be a tie at the top. If two acts tie at the top, and that's what these two fingers mean, then of course either act is right, either act is permissible. What's obligatory is that you perform at least one of those two acts that are tied. If three acts were tied at the top, then you've got to perform one of those three. Okay? So that's ethical egoism. We now have a formal statement of the theory, and we've looked at several misconceptions about the theory. We are now in a position to evaluate the theory. Now, we're not covering every section of this chapter. We're covering only three. We've now covered two of the three, leaving only one to go. And the one that we have remaining is called the refutation of ethical egoism. And in that short section, Feldman claims to come up with a knockdown, dragged out argument that refutes ethical egoism. So before you watch my next lecture next week, make sure you've read that section carefully. Try to come up with a response to Feldman. I think that'll be a good exercise for you. Ask yourself whether the ethical egoist should grab the bull by the horn or bite the bullet. That'll be the task for you to think about for next week. Have a great day and a great weekend. We have one more lecture before the exam, which is on the 1st of April, a week from today. See you next week.